Mr. Courtney, can you hear us? Mr. Courtney, can you hear us?
Well, okay, got a quick question here for you. You're coming through quite loud on the speakers. Is that a problem on your end, or should I put in my headphones?
Probably you can put on your headphones.
Sure. Okay. Just give me a sec.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. This is a small class of mine, and where we try to understand Taiwan and China in through historical terms. And class, this is Mr. Smith. I'll just introduce you, and the floor will be yours.
Anyway, I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for the invite. I know this is the first year of Taiwan Studies, and I'm very excited that Taiwan Studies are now in India. That's really good news. So I guess I'll jump right in. Okay, so this year is the campaigning will be going on this year for next January's national election. Now, I'll start here with what are the main issues in local and national elections. And this is kind of important for how all of this might play out. Now, in local elections, the issues are pretty much what you'd expect. They're, things like, sewage systems and parks and that kind of municipal or local issues. And on those issues, there's not really a sharp divide between the major parties. Now, in national elections, this is where you get the sharp divide. You have, on the one hand, you have the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, which takes a strong stance on Taiwan sovereignty and on relations with China. And nominally, they're technically pro-independence. In practice, they're not. Now, then, of course, there's the Kuomintang, and they are considered a much more, they're considered more pro-China. They do believe in a one China ideology, which we'll get into this in a little bit, but I just want to bring this out right in the beginning. And there are other smaller parties that support one side or the other. So the pan-blue side, which is the Kuomintang, and is led by the Kuomintang and smaller parties. And then there's the pan-green side, which is led by the DPP and smaller parties that have similar ideology. The reason for the colors is blue is the main color on the KMT's flag, or the Kuomintang's flag, and green is the primary color on the DPP's flag. So essentially in Taiwan, what you have is this blue-green divide, and that's on the issue of sovereignty and relations with China. That's the fundamental split in Taiwan politics. Unlike most countries, there's not a left-wing, right-wing, or a liberal conservative split between the two major parties. There was a little bit in the presidential election last time around, where certain elements supporting the KMT presidential candidate started flirting with more socially conservative issues. But by and large, what you'll find is that there are left-wing and right-wing elements in both of the two major parties. They're not really divided along left-wing, right-wing, conservative, liberal lines. Sorry. So now, something that I think is really quite interesting about Taiwan's politics is that the two major parties are really just not normal at all. They're a weird pair of parties. And this is something that a lot of people kind of don't talk about, is just how weird the political situation is in Taiwan. And that is because if you look at the history of the two major parties, they're very unusual. So if you start with the KMT started out in the late 19th century and was born out of secret societies who wanted to overthrow the Manchurian emperor. Now, they rallied under a cry of topple the Qing, which is the Manchurians, and restore the Ming, which essentially was an ethno-nationalistic stance, where by restoring the Ming, what they meant by that was to restore ethnic Chinese rule to China, rather than just being a component part of the Manchurian Empire. And of course, it was the Manchurians that made them shave their head in the front and have the long queue in the back. And that was forcing all the men to show their loyalty and obedience to the Manchurians. So now, when they actually set up the Republic of China, of course, they did a 180-degree turn and said that all of the Manchurian components belonged to China. So they were including the other parts of the Manchurian Empire that the Manchurians had conquered and then claimed it for China. So that would include Manchuria itself, Mongolia, Tibet, the Uyghurs, and Taiwan, which had been conquered from the indigenous population. So they claimed all of that. That would be a little bit like, say, if, in the early 20th century, Egypt, which was probably the biggest component part of, or one of the biggest component parts of the Ottoman Empire, not Turkey, claimed the entire Ottoman Empire as its territory. That would be kind of the logic. But they more or less got away with it until the Soviet Union helped Manchuria become independent, but otherwise, China still claims all of the other territory that belonged to the Manchurians. So the KMT came out of that background. Of course, they lost the civil war in China, came to Taiwan, established a one-party state. Now, this is where it gets really important for Taiwan. Now, they still have, in various degrees of strength, a lot of their earlier ideology, which is based on the three principles of Sun Yat-sen and so on and so forth. But when they came to Taiwan, they imposed an effective one-party state. They did allow some smaller parties, but all of them had to show loyalty to the KMT. They were essentially puppets, a lot like the situation in China now, where I believe there are 8 approved political parties, but all of them have to show allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. So that was the situation in Taiwan. They did allow local elections. And this actually has an impact today, in that when the KMT arrived, they couldn't control everything themselves. They tried. The Chinese immigrants, or the 49ers who came over around 1949, they took the big, powerful government positions, company positions. They basically took over all of the top-level power structures. But on the local level, they needed to work with the local elites. And so what they did is they came up with a factional system where the actual election would be controlled by local factions that were limited by their geographic region. They weren't allowed to expand. And so each area would have 1 or 2 or 3 factions. And then they would compete for power within that geographic region. So, for example, here in Taichung, the KMT had the red faction and the black faction, and these are still in existence today. Now, what these factions are is they're political patronage factions. In other words, they use political power and their access to budgets, and for a long time they controlled like local credit cooperatives and so on and so forth, irrigation associations, farming associations, which they still largely control. And then they would use these to raise money for themselves, which they could then buy votes with. Now, this was all with an eye on, because candidates could run as independents. So what the KMT did to keep power and to make sure that no local power blocks arose, to block independent candidates, these factions were very corrupt and would buy votes and so on and so forth. But then the KMT had this divide and conquer to make sure that there's more than one faction that would have to battle it out. And then that meant that local Taiwanese whose families had been here for hundreds of years would not be able to unite around any single force. So that was the logic behind that. Now, those factions still remain a potent force in parts of the country, particularly more rural and more traditional areas. And so they're still a factor, something to keep in mind when thinking about the KMT. Now, the KMT to this day, okay, I'll get into that in a minute in a different topic, but now the current ideology of the KMT as defined by Eric Zhu or Zhu Liluan, he is touting what he calls a double D program. Now, this is what he calls dialogue and deterrence, or deterrence and dialogue, whichever order he puts it in. And what that means is that he wants to build up the military, which is the deterrence part, but he wants dialogue with China. Now, this is very interesting because last year, back in June, he made an effort he went out and he went to the United States and declared, and he did this many times for a while during last summer, he took a line which was that the KMT has always been pro-US, friendly with Japan, and anti-communist, and he tried to downplay the 1992 consensus. He clearly lost that battle inside the KMT. Now, that would have put, if he had succeeded in this, and he even started borrowing talking lines from the DPP, like saying, Taiwan is already an independent country with a name Republic of China, which is right out of President Tsai Ing-wen's playbook. Now, if he'd succeeded at that, he would have moved the party much closer to the mainstream of Taiwan public opinion. However, by the fall, he backed off on a lot of that. He started talking about how good the 1992 consensus is and the importance of dialogue with China. And so obviously he lost some kind of internal power struggle within the KMT over these issues. Because there's a range of opinions within the KMT. But I saw a survey, it was maybe 2-3 years ago, something like it was a little over 80% of KMT members support the 1992 consensus, which, if I'm sure you've heard about this, but what it refers to is that there were meetings between the Taiwanese side and the Chinese side in 1992. And starting in the year 2000, the KMT started referring to this so-called 1992 consensus, which didn't actually exist at the time. But it has become something of, it's kind of taken on a life of its own. But the 1992 consensus has two variants: the Taiwanese variant, or the KMT's variant, I should specify just the KMT's variant, which is there is one China, both sides with their both sides with their different interpretation. There's different ways of translating, but basically it's Taiwan and China are one China, but each side of the Taiwan Strait has a different idea of what that means. The Chinese version has always been just simply the 1992 consensus is there is one China and Taiwan is a part of it. There's nothing about both sides having their own opinion. There's nothing in the Chinese version of it that shows any respect or acknowledgement of the Taiwanese side. So that's kind of baked into it. Now, in Taiwan, the 1992 consensus with a mainstream voting public is extremely unpopular. Depending on the poll, it'll be, most of them, it's over 80% reject one China and the 1992 consensus. So what I think was happening last summer is that Eric Chu is trying to move back into the mainstream of public opinion, but harder line figures and the powerful elites who come almost entirely from 49er families who fled in the Chinese Civil War, they made him back down. So he's going into this upcoming election with that baggage. He's still having to carry this baggage. Now, within the KMT, you could break it down into several groupings. At what they call the deep blue, or even sometimes called red after the Chinese Communist Party flag, is those who believe in immediate unification with China or beginning negotiations on it happening soon. They're a pretty small minority. There is a guy who's not in the KMT who just announced that he's running for president. He will probably get less than 1% of the vote, but he believes in that. Then there's another group which are pro unification over the long term. And I put people like former President Ma Ying-jeou in that category. Now, he is on a trip in China, and he just came out and stated this. He said, all people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are Chinese, which 2/3 of the Taiwanese public would disagree with, and consider themselves purely Taiwanese and don't consider themselves Chinese at all. But this is his ideology, and he referred to, eventual unification. But he also came out and said that both sides of both sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to the Republic of China, which I thought was a little amusing. Anyway, then you have the compradors. They're also called the Taishang. And these are people in the KMT who have strong business or sometimes family ties with China. And they want good relations with China. They may or may not believe in eventual unification or one China or anything like that. They may or they may not. But their primary motivation is business and practical concerns. So there are a lot of them in the KMT as well. Then you've got the light blues. And this group is much closer to mainstream public opinion. Former party chair Johnny Jiang falls into this category. Eric Chu sounded like this last summer. And these are people who are pro-US, strong Taiwan military. They believe that Taiwan is an independent country, but they want to preserve the name and constitution of the Republic of China. So this is not obviously a normal political party. A lot of the people in it, they have a whole ideology, they have a whole mythology, and that revolves around, heroic heroes fighting the Japanese in World War II, and fighting the communists. Meanwhile, during World War II, the Taiwanese were part of the Japanese Empire and were fighting on the Japanese side, which, there's a whole lot going on there. So let's move on to the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. This is also not a normal political party. They came out of the Deng Wai movement, which is because you couldn't form new parties. It was a coalition basically of independent candidates who were running in local elections. Now, they were an odd grab bag of people with different ideologies. Some were even from 49er families and believed in unification with China, whereas others believed in an independent Taiwan. Others had other political agendas, left-wing, more right-wing. But they all came together to demand democracy. That was what brought them together. And they formed the Democratic Progressive Party. But something to keep in mind is that a lot of these people, their primary goal, not all of them, but a lot of them, their primary goal, and this is still true of a fair percentage of the DPP today, is to actually destroy the KMT and drive it out of Taiwan. They were really filled with a lot of hatred for the repressive one-party state and martial law under the KMT. So they were formed with a lot of anger. Now, the 49ers and the pro-unificationists who joined the party, but they were pro-democracy early on, left the party, leaving it mostly with the pro-Taiwan independence movements with making up the party. And they campaigned on having a referendum to declare Taiwan independent and get a new constitution. And they got killed in the polls. This would be the early 90s. By the late 90s, they accepted that they weren't going to win on that platform. And that the majority of the public was okay with keeping the name Republic of China because China had repeatedly said they would go to war if Taiwan changed the name. And so large percentage of the population's attitude toward this is it's just not worth changing the name, for a lot of people to die in a war. It's just keep the name. So the DPP accepted kind of that reality in the late 1990s. And that's pretty much where they are today. They believe in promoting the history of Taiwan. They refer to Taiwan much more regularly. They talk about, Taiwanese sovereignty. But they're not, there are some within the party who still want to declare an independent Republic of Taiwan and change the constitution, but they're in a minority in the party now. Most have taken a more practical, mainstream public opinion approach. Now, in 2014, we had the Sunflower Movement, which saw hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, activists occupied the legislature. Then we had hundreds of thousands of people came out into the streets to protest against then President Ma Ying-jeou of the KMT, because people started realizing he was actually making moves towards a gradual unification with China. He was lowering defense spending to below 2% of GDP. He was working to make the Taiwanese and Chinese economies more intertwined. And he was working to build cultural ties as well. And there was a sea change in public opinion at that point, where particularly younger people, but also a lot among older people, they really started to think through what was their actual position on these issues in a way that they hadn't before. And what happened is that the mainstream of Taiwanese public opinion shifted, and that put the DPP pretty much smack dab in the center of Taiwan mainstream public opinion. So, excuse me, my voice is going a little bit here. So that's sort of where we've been since 2014. Now, we're going to get back to this topic in a minute. Now, there's 3 other parties that were elected to the legislature last time. The Taiwan People's Party, which is a very new one. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But it was founded in 2019 by Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je. And he was previously an independent. His main line is that they are not blue, they are not green, that the party is practical and rational, and that they try to find a middle line or include both pan and blue elements. They're generally perceived by political analysts, by a lot of their rhetoric, as being light blue, but not always. Now, for example, Ke takes a line, Ko Wen-je, which is the party chairman and their presidential candidate, takes a line that he said, for example, he said, there is no 1992 consensus. There is only a 1996 consensus. And he's referring to when Taiwan became a full democracy with the presidential election that year. So he was saying that basically the consensus in Taiwan is that Taiwan is a democracy, and that's deepening. So he's rejected the one thing that China demands. The Chinese side absolutely demands recognition of the 1992 consensus before they will talk. So the TPP has rejected that. He's also came out and just said the other day that he doesn't believe that there will be a one China, a united one China anytime soon. He just says that's just unrealistic, I think is the word that he used. On the other hand, he believes in dialogue with China, much more so than the DPP, and talks about it more, and has kept up dialogue when he was the Taipei mayor. And he says things like, people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are one family, which to somebody who's a DPP follower sounds very blue. So if you're in the KMT, he does sound more green. And if you're on the pan-green side, he sounds more blue. So that's kind of where he's been positioning himself. And now it's very interesting because he's been starting to come out with much clearer statements of ideology recently in just the last few days. So I'm really keen to see how it plays out. And we'll know more, I think, as we get closer to the presidential election. We've only just gotten some very recent indications of where he's going in his thinking. So some of those quotes that I just gave you, literally, he stated them the first time in just the last few days. So including the 96 consensus, and there will be no one China anytime soon. So, and there's 2 other parties, the New Power Party, which came out of the Sunflower Movement, but they've been hit with corruption scandals and a series of corruption scandals and infighting, ideological infighting, and so they're kind of weak right now. But they just got a new chairwoman, and we'll see how that goes. The Taiwan State Building Party is the biggest party that is most overtly pro-independence, Republic of Taiwan now kind of a party. So I want to talk about a little bit about the role of primaries in Taiwan's election system. Because unlike, I'm not very familiar with Indian politics. I very vaguely kind of follow the top level stuff, but I don't really have any nuance on it at all. But say, for example, in countries like, say, Canada and the US, which are the 2 countries I grew up in, the primary systems, they don't really change from election to election. they'll tinker with it, maybe, they're talking about moving, where the first state will be held, the primary state, in the Democratic Party in the US, but these are relatively minor changes from an election to an election. In Taiwan, the choice of how the primaries are held are a major strategic choice. And this has been really important in the last local elections and in this one. There are several ways that they can go about this. Up until the last political cycle, the political cycles before that, going back several elections, has usually been one of two things. Either they try and negotiate between the potential candidates to just choose one to avoid a primary. That's their preferred option. But the more common way of doing it is that they'll have an opinion poll primary, and then whoever's the most popular wins the primary. Or a 70-30 split, or sometimes a slightly different percentage, but 70% public opinion poll, 30% party member polling. Now, back in the 90s, it was much more common to use things like 100% party member polling only, or party member balloting. Now, there's another way that you can run your primary, and that is that the party chair, maybe assisted by an advisory committee, just simply chooses the candidate. In other words, they say, okay, I'm just going to decide that this is the candidate, and we're not going to have any primary at all, and that's it. So that's the other way that they can do this. So this is quite important in the last election and this one, because there's been a big shift here. But what's interesting is that sometimes for different candidates in different races, even if they're the same type of race, they might apply one set of rules to one race and a different set of rules to another one, which is quite an interesting way of doing this. So now this became important in last November's local elections. In last November's local elections, the KMT won in a landslide. And they won 14 of 23 races, excuse me here. And the DPP was crushed. They only won 5, which is the worst result they've ever had in local elections, ever since their party first ran. And there are several reasons for this. The fundamental one, I think, well, let's start with, okay, strategically, the KMT made a few smart strategic moves, and the DPP made some really bad moves. The KMT made smart moves. Initially, their very first primaries, they actually used public opinion polling, but after the first one, I think it was, every single one for all of the other 22 administrative areas for the top people, they still had opinion poll primaries for city council and county council races. But for the top positions, Eric Ju went out of his way. He just decided who the candidate would be. Now, that did backfire on him in 2 places, where that led to a disgruntled potential candidate running against the party and beating the KMT, a chosen candidate. But by and large, outside of those two, it worked out quite well for the KMT. Now, what Eric Ju was doing, and this is my analysis of what he was doing, is he was picking candidates who were more from the closer to the mainstream public opinion, not the type that are deep blue ideologues. So they're not going to say anything too particularly embarrassing, that would drag the party into all kinds of arguments. And then he picked, out of the 23 candidates, 10 of them were women. Now, this is important because this is a trend I've noticed in the last few elections and have been watching closely. And to my surprise, Tsai Ing-wen, who was the DPP party chair, herself a woman, apparently was not aware of this shift going on in voting patterns. So the KMT did really well with this, leaning in heavily on women candidates. And for example, after the last local elections in November, it came out that of 2/3 of the female candidates who ran won their races, versus only 50% of the men who won their races. So you can see there's been a shift toward people preferring to vote for female candidates. Now, the DPP suffered from a series of missteps. One was they only ran 5 women. So that sort of out of the gate, that hurt them. They ended up in a series of faked thesis scandals that took down some of their most prominent candidates and really damaged them reputationally in the north of Taiwan. I don't think it hurt them much in the center or south, but it did them a lot of damage in the north. And then their main campaign they ran on was Fanzhong Baotai, which is a slogan they used in the previous national elections to great effect. And what it means is resist China, protect Taiwan. Now that worked really well in national elections back in 2015, 2016, and again in 2019, 2020. But in local elections, voters kind of felt like they were just it was just a cheap slogan. And the reason why is that when you're in a national election, a slogan like this makes sense. Because when you're choosing a national legislator or the president, a legislator will be voting on defense budgets and foreign affairs budgets. And the president will be choosing the cabinet and the foreign minister and top generals. And so a slogan like resist China, protect Taiwan gives you an idea of the kind of governing thinking that they will have when making these important decisions. However, in local elections, they tried to use this slogan in local elections. But local elections, it really doesn't matter what your ideology is on China when you're voting on things like a local pet park or childcare or sewage systems. You know, it doesn't really matter if you believe in resisting China and protecting Taiwan if you're talking about sewage budgets. So people felt like the DPP were just giving them empty slogans. Now, I wrote a piece on this where the DPP actually could have used the slogan to some effect. They could have added, for example, into their planks, not make this the center necessarily of their campaigns, but along with the pet parks and childcare and schooling and sewage planks in their platforms, they could have included things like training to, for emergency personnel, the police, the fire department, and so on, to rehearse and do drills in case China attacked. They do this kind of thing for typhoons and earthquakes. Why not for a Chinese attack? They also could have campaigned on budgets for hardening certain types of infrastructure. Taiwan's air raid, air raid bunkers are a mess. A friend of mine actually looked into this, and most of them are like basements where people are storing their boxes and stuff. Almost none of these air raid shelters are viable. So they could have said, we're going to put in budgets to making them viable and hardening them. But the DPP, not one of their candidates did this. So they ran on a slogan that was quite empty. So at the end of the local elections, the DPP got killed. Now, moving to the national elections, which is what we're looking at now, there's two conflicting trends, and I'm going to get to a new trend that's appearing in a minute, but there's two trends that have played out over the last several election cycles. One goes back to 2000. So every president elected since the year 2000 has been elected to 2 terms. But that also means that political party has been given 2 terms. Now, if that were to continue to hold, that would suggest that because President Tsai can't run again because of term limits, that following that traditional pattern, that the KMT would win this upcoming national election, at least for the presidency, and possibly win back the legislature. But definitely on the presidency, that would be what that pattern suggests. However, since the Sunflower Movement, a different pattern has appeared, and it's what I call conservative safe bet voters. And these voters are choosing their candidates and the party they vote for based on what they think is the safest bet. Now, in the last 2 local election cycles, the KMT won in a landslide. In the last 2 presidential and national election cycles, the DPP won in a landslide. So what's going on here? Well, possibly one other explanation is that the public just sort of wants to tell the parties that they want to balance them out. But here's what I think is going on. Now, when it comes to local elections, there is a perception that the KMT is better at getting things done. And I've actually had a lot of dealings with government in business. And I'd say more often than not, that's actually been my experience. But of course, it's not always true by any means. There's definitely been some excellent DPP administrations and some terrible KMT ones. But that's the general perception. So in local elections where the public feels safe voting for candidates of their choice, they choose the KMT because they think they're going to get things done, like that pet park, that kind of thing. And when it comes to national elections, though, mainstream public opinion is now, most people identify as Taiwanese. They reject the 1992 consensus. They think that the KMT is far too close to China and has too many ties with China and the Chinese Communist Party. And so the mainstream voting public votes for the DPP because they're the safer bet on Taiwan's sovereignty and defending it. So you've got these 2 different conflicting trends. You've got the 2 terms on the one hand, and then you've got what I'm calling these safe bet voters on the other. So how this is going to play out in this election, I don't know, because these 2 are now coming head to head. I've got some theories, but maybe we'll talk about that later. So now, after the debacle in November, when the DPP, in December, polling showed the DPP had taken a massive hit in popularity, but they've bounced back. And they've got a few things going for them right now. One is that their presidential candidate and party chair, Lai Ching-te, who's also, by the way, the current vice president, he's one of the most popular politicians in the country and has been for a long time. He's managed to keep his party's factions under control. Oops, I forgot to mention the DPP factions. When the DPP was founded, because there's all these different groups of people came into the party with different ideologies and different priorities, they formed these really strong factions, and they used to fight with each other brutally and the press. And what they're trying to do is make sure that more of the candidates of the party were theirs, more of the party power positions were theirs. If they got elected to government, that it was their factions, people who got chosen. So they're really quite brutal. But when Tsai Ing-wen became the party chair, she did something really smart. She basically fixed the percentages of all these things that go to each faction. So New Tide, you get 40%. You know, the Ocean faction, you get 10%. And then she kept it almost completely uniformly and then balanced out different factions that way. And it's been quite effective. It looks like Lai Ching-te has managed to more or less keep the peace between the factions so far. The DPP also does appear to be unified, and there's also been clarity on their candidate, which is important because nobody challenged Lai Ching-te to become party chair, and nobody challenged him to a primary to become the presidential nominee. So you've got a very unified party, and so they have bounced back in the polls. So right now, Lai Ching-te is leading in all the polls, even though he was leading throughout all of last year. And then one of the potential KMT candidates passed him in December, but he's now back on top, and he's got a sizable lead in most polls. Now, the KMT is still choosing their candidate. The most popular candidate right now, according to most polling, is new Taipei Mayor Hou You-yi. Now, for years, he has been consistently ranked the most popular politician in the country. However, just recently, he started to slip in the polls. Depending on which poll you look at, his support has dropped by double digits. It's still fairly high, but he's dropped back behind Lai Ching-te in the polling, and his personal popularity, according to at least one or two recent polls, is he's no longer the most popular politician in the country. He's still pretty popular, but he is losing ground quickly. Now, he also has yet to declare whether he's running for president or not. He also, nobody knows what his positions are on most national issues, including what is his stance on China? What are his stances on sovereignty issues and cultural localization? He's also got some other problems. Now, by the way, his lack of stands on these issues, I think, is why he's dropping in popularity. I think his constant, oh, I'm just working, and when he gets asked these questions, he says things like, I'm just doing my job as new Taipei mayor, and he just smiles, and and that's it, right? He just won't answer these questions. I think people are getting a little bit fed up with that because now they want to know. Before he was just doing his job as a new Taipei mayor, that was fine. But now people really want to know because he's the front runner on the KMT side to be their presidential nominee. Now, he's got a few problems. The party elites in the KMT, as I mentioned, are often dominated by 49er families. Ho is actually from a Taiwanese family who's been in Taiwan for hundreds of years. And so there's powerful people in the party who say things like he'll be a Li Denghui 2.0 and he's a secret separatist and pro-independence supporter. And they say things like he has blue skin but green bones, which I think you can figure out what that analogy means. I think in English, what would we say? We'd say blue on the outside, green on the inside. So there's a lot of suspicion of him within the party. Then there's Terry Go. He's the founder of Foxconn, which I'm sure you've heard of. They have some big factories in India. Now, Terry Goh is quite a character. He's known in business circles as Genghis Khan for his leadership style and take no prisoners approach. He says often kind of outrageous things. He says things like he's questioned the value of democracy before. He has talked about how Taiwan shouldn't buy so many weapons from the United States. He's clearly close to the Chinese Communist Party and is reportedly a buddy of Xi Jinping. So he's kind of got some things going against him. On the other hand, his kind of brash outsider appearance and his business knowledge, and he's clearly a smart guy, he appeals to a fair number of people through that. So he polls reasonably well, not as well as Hoyoi, but respectably. But he's got a couple of problems. One is in 2015, he said that the sea goddess Matsu came to him in a dream and told him to join the KMT and run in their presidential primary. Well, apparently Matsu was playing a joke on him because he lost in the primary. Now, he's a very thin-skinned character. And so he quit the party. He quit the party and called them corrupt, and he said all kinds of nasty things about the KMT. And the problem is that if he wants to be, if he was included in this time around, he's not eligible to rejoin the party until September, because the way he quit the party, he was banned for 4 years, which of course, by September, the KMT will have their presidential nominee. However, in 2015, they bent the rules to let him join the primary because he hadn't been a party member for more than a year. And they could change the rules again to let him back in early. You know, they could do that. Now, there's some small candidates who I won't get into. Another candidate who's the possibility is Eric Zhu himself, the KMT party chair. We know that he wants to run because he ran in 2015, 2016. He lost, but we know he has this ambition. And he's reasonably popular within certain circles in the elites in his party. Oh, I forgot to mention, by the way, that Terry Goh from Foxconn is also a 49er. He comes from a 49er family. Eric Zhu comes from a mixed 49er family, but he's considered a safe bet, I think, by the party elites. And he's obviously a very, very smart politician, as shown by his strategic moves in the local elections last November. Then there's a candidate who keeps saying I'm not going to run, no. But I actually think would be their strongest choice, which is Taichung Mayor Liu Xiaoyan. She actually beat Hoyoi recently in a poll on personal popularity among her constituents. She's a woman. She's a savvy politician. And she's based in Taichung, which is a battleground area here in central Taiwan. I actually think she would be the smartest candidate for them to go with. Now, you remember I mentioned the primaries and how important they were? Now, Eric Zhu, just about a week or so ago, dropped a bombshell. He said there's not going to be any primaries for the KMT's presidential candidate. He's going to make the decision. So this really is a very interesting thing, because he's going to make the final decision himself with, on who it's going to be. Not a committee of high-ranking people. No, He's formed a high-ranking committee to choose the legislative candidates, but there's no such committee for choosing the presidential candidate. He's decided to do it himself, which is a pretty stunning power grab. It also opens up the possibility that he could choose himself as the presidential candidate, which would shock a lot of people, frankly. So we don't really know. Now, Terry Gou has declared he's running. Liu Xiaoyan has said, oh, no, I won't. But in Taiwan, that's normal. Even if you want to, often you say, oh, I'm not going to run, I'm not going to run. And then finally, lots of people say, oh, you should run, you should run, you should run. And then they humbly accept it. Okay. So if Eric Chu chose her as the candidate, she probably wouldn't say no. She would go, oh, she would politely decline 3 times and then accept. That's the political culture. And Hou Youyi, we don't know if he's going to run or not. I think he is, but I have no proof of that. Just reading between the lines, a few things he said. So I don't know. So finally, we've got the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, Ke Wen-je, who's already declared that he's running. Sorry, my nose is itchy. Now, he's running 3rd in most polls, but he's polling respectably well. He's still polling in around 20%. However, when matched up in a poll against Lai Ching-te comes out ahead consistently now. If it's Hou Youyi the candidate, he comes out doing respectably well, but a fair number of points behind Lai Ching-te. And then Ke Wen-je comes in 3rd at about 20%, with Hou maybe somewhere in the mid to upper 20s, and Lai in say the mid 30s. That's kind of where we're at right now. But Ke Wen-je, if Terry Gou is the candidate or Eric Chu is the candidate, Ke Wen-je comes in 2nd. So a lot of people in the KMT are saying you've got to go with Hou Youyi. He's the only one who can, we don't want the KMT to come in 3rd. That would be totally humiliating. So now there's some very interesting thing going on here with both the Taiwan People's Party and Ke Wen-je. The narrative that everyone says right now, and that's considered common knowledge ever since the Sunflower Movement, is that the younger people are now all pan-green. I've been doing a deep dive into the numbers, and that's no longer true. What's very interesting is that among 20 to 29-year-olds, I just looked at a poll that just came out recently. On 20 to 29-year-olds, 26.2% support the DPP's Lai, 23.1% support the KMT's Hou, but 35.4% support Ke Wen-je. What's also interesting is that 20 to 29-year-olds showed the lowest satisfaction rating for the DPP, meaning that they were the Democrat and the highest dissatisfaction with the DPP of all demographics. So they're definitely not pan-green, but they're not very pan-blue either. They don't really like the DPP or the KMT. So what happened here? I mean, there's this standard line that young people are all now pan-green because they're pro-Taiwan identity, pro-Taiwan sovereignty, worried about China, and so on and so forth. Well, I looked at, and I started really noticing this in the run-up to last November's elections, because TPP candidates also got really high support from, and TPP-backed candidates got really high support levels from this 20 to 29 demographic, followed by support from the 30 to 39-year-old demographic. So here's what I think is going on. The 30 to 39-year-olds are, in most metrics, are the most pan-green. That's because they're the sunflower movement generation. But 20 to 29-year-olds, most of them now, because the sunflower movement was 9 years ago, only the oldest of them really were impacted by the sunflower movement. And most of them have grown up and spent almost all their life under the DPP administration of Taiwan. And salaries have not really risen a whole lot, although they didn't under the KMT's Ma either. Housing prices have skyrocketed out of control. And they feel very lackluster, like they don't have a lot of opportunity. And of course, they blame the Thai administration, the DPP administration, for this. Now, I delivered a lecture actually here locally at Donghai University, and I asked the students, you know, why do you think it is that the TPP enjoys such high support? And they said some of the things I just said, but they added that they get their news from social media, not the traditional pan-blue or pan-green media. And they also said things like the TPP speaks directly. The TPP is about getting things done. They're not blue or green. In other words, there's something different. They're fed up with the DPP. I think their older brothers and sisters in the 30 to 39 demographic who hate the KMT warned them off the KMT, so they don't really like the KMT either. So where do you go? They went to the Taiwan People's Party, the new party that was founded in 2019. So going forward, I'll wrap up here. So going forward, we really don't know who the KMT's candidate is yet, and that's going to have a big impact on how this all plays out. However, and of course, there's a long time before the election and a lot can change. My suspicion is that now I used a series of proxy. I used kind of a proxy analysis on a bunch of numbers. And I estimate that the TPP, you know, most people view them as taking people primarily from the KMT side, light blue supporters. I did it in my analysis. I estimate that between a quarter and a third of the support going to Ko-wen-je is coming from people who are either pan-green or would have otherwise voted pan-green. So the TPP is still taking more votes from the KMT, but they're also taking younger voters. Now, if the KMT goes with Ho or Liu Xiaoyan, I think they still have a fighting chance to win. But I think that unless the candidate is willing to distance themselves from the 1992 consensus and one China ideology, I don't see Taiwan voters voting for a president with that kind of ideology. I think it's just too wildly unpopular now. So I don't see that happening. However, if the Hou Yu-ih or Liu Xiaoyan comes out and ditches the 1992 consensus or drops a one China ideology, then yeah, they really could win. That's a possibility. So at this point, I'd say that Lai Ching-te has the strongest chance because Ko-wen-je is taking more votes from the KMT, and the KMT has an ideology that's largely unelectable. That being said, in the last two elections, the DPP won outright majorities in the legislature, and I think they're going to lose that in this coming election. There's three types of seats. There's party list, which people vote for the party as a percentage. There's 35 of them. Then there's 70, was it 73, 76? District first past the post seats. So they represent a district. And then there's 6 indigenous seats, which are voted on by indigenous Taiwanese. Now, what happened in the last election, the last national election, which is very interesting, people voted overwhelmingly for the DPP in their district, but voted about evenly in the party list. Now, that meant that the DPP still won an overwhelming landslide victory. They got 60 some odd in the seat. There's 113 total, and they got 60 some odd. So they had an outright majority. And the KMT only got was 35, 36. And the Taiwan People's Party got 5 entirely out of the party list. And the new power party, the NPP, got 3, again, entirely out of the party list. You have to get 5% of the vote on the party list to be able to qualify for just one party list seat. I think Ko Wen-je just came out and said the other day that he's hoping that on the party list, they'll get 8 seats. I actually think they might get that's the low end of my estimate. I think that on the party list, they'll get somewhere between 8 and 12. So that would boost the size of their caucus significantly and could actually put them in a position to be the balance of power between the DPP and the KMT, which is exactly, I think, what Ko Wen-je wants. So there's a decent chance that the Taiwan People's Party could end up being that balance of power in the next legislature. It's not a lock. Now, I don't think, though, and Ke agrees with my assessment. I wrote about this a while ago, and maybe he's reading my articles. I don't know. But he came out and said the other day that winning district seats is tough for the TPP. He didn't go into why, but I can explain why. They just don't have the party infrastructure that the other parties do yet because they're still too new. They don't have as many experienced political operatives. They don't have as many local politicians who have name recognition. So you put it all together and it's tough for a new, smaller party to break in to the legislature through a direct district election. Although the Taiwan State Building Party did actually win one in the last national elections, but it's tough. It's hard to win those. They might win a small number, 1, 2, 3, but I don't see them winning a lot at this point. That a lot could change though. So we're going to have to see. So, all right, I think I'll wrap up here. We've been going just a little over an hour, I think. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. I think this is lovely to the way you went through from the historical aspect of the parties, of the since Taiwan and to the current, especially the survey, the current survey where you put up the 20 to 29 years old.
Can you speak closer to the mic? The reason is because you're echoing.
Okay. Is it better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So I think the survey data that you mentioned from 20 to 29 years old and the post 30 ones, those are something very interesting. And again, I could relate so much to this discussions that you put through it because I've been reading through. I felt like you are being explaining your own articles to here, which have been read so much. So, but I'll keep the floor open now for the students to ask questions if they have.
Yeah. Any questions?
Good evening, sir. I hope that you're doing well. So the domestic politics that you explained to us rather gives us the picture that most of the Taiwanese citizens and people, they are like ambiguous on the Taiwanese question at the end of the day, like whether reunification with Chinese mainland. So, with the given situation in the Taiwanese strait, with the US and China competition like basically going on, do you think that the Taiwanese people can actually stay ambiguous for in the long term, in the coming time?
Okay, I only heard about half of that because of the echo in the room. Can you repeat the question for me here close to the mic?
Yeah. So, what the question is, can Taiwanese people can stay ambiguous given the current geopolitical tensions between US and China?
Taiwan, I would not say is ambiguous now. I mean, I'm not sure ambiguous about what.
But this question, so with the reunification with Chinese mainland.
Yeah, come on up.
So my question is like, given the present situation, I'm not saying that they're like ambiguous regarding whatever their stance is, but more on the Taiwanese question, whether they want the reunification with the Chinese mainland or not. Because even though the polls show recently in 2022 when the polls came out, just a second, around 1.3% of the respondents wanted reunification with mainland China, but at the same time, similarly low percentage, which was 5.1%, desired formal Taiwanese independence. So I just feel that with these low percentages and low numbers, there can be a certain amount of ambiguity regarding the Taiwanese question, right? So I just want to know if that can like go on in the longer term, given the present geopolitical situation.
So what you're saying is maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. A note on the polling, by the way. A lot of it has to do with how it's phrased. There's some polls that show a majority of Taiwanese would prefer to be independent, but a lot of it has to do with how the questions are phrased. But the way it's usually phrased in most polling is that the majority of people would prefer to maintain the status quo, not be annexed by China and not declare a Republic of Taiwan. And that's, so the majority of people are pretty much, and usually the support for, say, unification with China is usually in the low single digits, depending on the poll, right? The poll that I follow the most closely on that issue, it's usually about between 1.5 and 2% and 3%. Now, most people want to keep the status quo because it just means that there's no war. There have been polls showing that where they're explicitly asked if there was no threat of war from China, should Taiwan declare an independent Taiwan? And the vast majority of people said yes. So it's the threat of war from China that keeps most Taiwanese from wanting to change the name of the country to the Republic of Taiwan, which I hope they don't do, because the acronym would be ROT, which would sound terrible. If they change the name, I'm hoping they just go with Taiwan. Yeah, I mean, it's the threat from China. That's the main thing here. But you'll notice President Tsai's formulation of this, and she very famously said this on BBC a while back. She said, the Republic of China, Taiwan, doesn't need to declare independence. Or she said, we don't need to declare independence. We're already an independent state called the Republic of China, Taiwan. So most people who support the status quo actually are supporting Taiwan independence in the sense of remaining independent of China. So that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about that subject. So yeah, the KMT's stance is that the Republic of China is an independent state as well. But they do still believe in a one China ideology, more of them with an idea of, you know, the unification would happen at some far off distant time in the future kind of thing. Or a lot of them believe in keeping the Republic of China independent indefinitely and viewing it as kind of a cultural sphere or something like that. But it's worth noting, by the way, that outside of since 1895, Taiwan was already a unique culture compared to China. A lot of immigrants came from China, but Taiwan was a frontier society, unlike China. So it had a different culture and ways of operating. And then in 1895, it became a Japanese colony. And the Japanese had a strong impact on Taiwan. And then briefly, it was administered from China from 1945 to 1949, technically as the representative of the Allied powers. It wasn't actually, sovereignty wasn't given to China at the time. They were just an occupying power in the Taiwan colony of the Japanese Empire, where the United States, as the representative Allied power, occupied the Japan home islands. And then through 1949 to the present, Taiwan has again, you know, been largely cut off from China until quite recently. So under the Japanese, there's very little connection between the two. And then, you know, up until quite recently, there was very little connection between the two. And keep in mind, you know, when Red Guards in China were, you know, smashing all the, you know, all the old cultural things and tearing down temples and you know, singing songs praising Mao Zedong, Taiwanese were listening to rock and roll and going to the temples as normal, you know, so they had a very different cultural experience. You know, the Chinese were influenced by the Russians, and they had a lot of Russian technical experts, and a lot of Russians were stationed in China, at least until the late 50s, early 60s. Whereas in Taiwan, it was the Americans. So there's also a lot of American cultural influence here in Taiwan, which China never got. They got a Soviet cultural influence. So Taiwanese and Chinese are now culturally quite distinct, you know, since 1895. To put this in perspective, Australia has only been an independent country since 1906. You know, and nobody would say Australians are British, right? You know, I'm Canadian. I was born in Canada, grew up in both Canada and the United States. Nobody would say that we're English. You know, my name's even Smith, and I don't consider myself English. You know, I speak English. We have some cultural connections and historical ties, but we have a different culture. We're a different people. So anyway, that's just sort of adding some context there. Are there any other questions? That was a great question, by the way.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sankhil. I hope you're doing well. So my question is really simple. First of all, as we are seeing that the USA cannot rely on Japan and other Indo-Pacific lands on the partners, because Japan has been also buying oil from Russia recently. So do you think, is it viable that, as Taiwan is really important for the future due to the semiconductor processing and every crucial technology they are producing right now, is it viable that USA should place some deterrence?
Can you come a little bit closer to the microphone? I'm still I'm hearing about half of what you're saying.
Is it viable and possible that US should place some nuclear weapons in Taiwan as a deterrence to China, as you have also said that Taiwan has followed 2 Ds, deterrence and diplomacy?
Okay, as far as nuclear weapons, the United States actually had nuclear weapons stationed in Taiwan at one time. I don't know exactly when that ended, but the Mutual Defense Treaty was ended in 1979. The reason I don't know exactly when they took out the nukes, it would have been 1979 or before. What I don't know is if they still had the nukes in Taiwan in 1979. They may have taken them out a few years earlier. In 1987, a colonel in Taiwan leaked to the United States and defected to the United States. He revealed Taiwan's secret nuclear weapons program. And then under then President Ronald Reagan, the Reagan administration put a stop to it. They said to Taiwan, no nukes. Now, at that time, Taiwan still had superiority in the Taiwan Strait, had a far more modern, far better Air Force, still had a strong Navy compared to China's, which was tiny at the time. And the Chinese were flying these ancient MiGs and, so at the time, Taiwan was still in a very strong position militarily. And, so I think the American logic at that time made sense that it would have just sort of needlessly escalated things. Now, whether or not with hindsight, considering China's massive ramping up of their military, whether with hindsight it was a good choice, that's a totally different question. And honestly, I've given a lot of thought to this issue, and I could make an argument for or against Taiwan having nuclear weapons. I think it's a really tough topic. So, and did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Yeah, we'll take one last question. I know it's late in Taiwan, so we'll just take one last question, and we have the next question.
Okay.
Good evening, sir. With being more than 50% Taiwanese investment in China, and also this growing trend that Taiwanese businessmen and women joining politics and running for offices, do you think this trend will play out in favor of China or Taiwan?
Okay, good question. That's actually become more and more of a sensitive topic. I would say mostly no, actually. And the reason I say this is that there was a time, first of all, ties are cooling between China and Taiwan, business-wise. A lot of the Taishang have returned. There's not as many Taiwanese doing business in China as there used to be. There's still a lot of business, but it's more and more concentrated into the hands of a few companies, whereas it used to be lots and lots of Taiwanese running kind of small, medium-sized businesses. A lot of those small, medium-sized businesses have failed and the Taiwanese have returned. So, I mean, if you look at overall trade, it's still pretty high, but a lot of that's in companies like Foxconn. And so there's less Taiwanese needed over there now. It's also become more of a sensitive issue. If if you have done a lot of business in China, or a close family member that can become a campaign issue. And there's a lot of concerns that, well, Terry Gou is no longer running Foxconn. He was the founder and still owns a lot of it. And his ties to China, I think, would make him unelectable. So, there may be enough sort of creeping in that they may be able to swing a couple of votes here or there, but not so much on the national level. I think a city council candidate, if their close family member or they themselves have done business in China, it's less of a campaign issue. But at the national level, I wouldn't be too worried about it. answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. Great
yes.
questions, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your time. And if you don't mind, can we take a picture with you on screen here with the students around you?
Yeah, please do, and send it to me.
Yes, sure. Please come over to the stage and take a picture. Yes, thank you again for your time, and I'll definitely send you the pictures.
Yes, please do. And thanks for inviting me. It's I'm glad you're doing Taiwan Studies. It makes me really happy. So I'm glad to help.
So yes, please stand here. We'll just change the camera angle here. You can come closer to this over here. Yes. Can come here. Yes, you can stay there, and then just take a picture from here. So. Okay. Yes. Students, come a little bit front. Okay. Look here. Okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay. One more. 1. Okay. Yes. The Taiwan style. Yes, it's good. Thank you so much, Mr. Smith, and we really appreciate your time and this talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you. And the questions were all great. So, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
All right. Take care. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
IT. Okay, somebody will also say, okay, fine, great. I think we are done here with this.